What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are finally getting back into Doomsday Clock, and that's the crazy thing. Doomsday Clock comes out like once every 2 or 3 months now. Like it's basically a quarterly publication, right? I mean, this is kind of the weird thing. You know, if DC Rebirth is really going back to the roots of comics, it actually kind of makes sense that DC would do something like this. I mean, this is being done because of, just delays in the title. But back in the day, like back when you had like the All-Star comics, like it was All-Star quarterly. Like you had quarterly comics that were released by by DC that would usually feature like team-ups, different things like that. It was a cool concept, and in reality, I wouldn't mind seeing DC bring back quarterly publications that are like big events or something along those lines. But it doesn't need to be like Marvel, where it's like a big crossover event every quarter. I mean, that's a little much, but it does fit in with the idea of fit in nicely with what DC's trying to achieve here. Now, really, in the last bit of Doomsday Clock, remember, this is really kind of Geoff Johns setting the stage for the post-Doomsday Clock era of DC, which is to say, what comes after Superman's conversation or really probably even battle with Dr. Manhattan. Of course, no idea how in the world Superman's going to win that fight. What this did is in a lot of ways, it picked up on really focused on Mime and Marionette. That's really what a lot of Doomsday Clock had done. But up to this point, we'd also seen like the return of Johnny Thunder, or at least we'd seen his character featured. We saw the return of the Lantern of Alan Scott. So like we know Alan Scott's out there somewhere. It's kind of like these little bits and bobs, these small little tidbits that Geoff Johns throws in that it's like the return of the JSA. Now, in truth, again, when it comes to Mime and Marionette, they're basically just, they're copies of, what is it, Patch and Julie, I think it is, but they're basically plays on characters that existed in Charlton Comics back in the day. But with Mime and Marionette, they're essentially new creations. And so we didn't really know what their story was. We didn't really know where they came from. But the last thing we'd seen is they'd found themselves rolled up in the Joker. And so, of course, when it comes to the character of Marionette herself, initially this picks up with this whole scenario of her father just at least seemingly being ransacked and her essentially watching it all. Now, what this does is it really like sets the stage for the tone of the story and really for the nature of them. Because what it means is it starts things off by essentially saying this girl comes from a very rough past. And that's one of the important things, because what you've also got is the two of them having met the Joker. And that's the big difference here. That's really kind of how Geoff Johns juxtaposes the Joker with Mime and Marionette and says they're not actually the same thing. Because when we first saw them, when we first picked up with Doomsday Clock and we looked at Mime and Marionette, it's like, okay, so they're basically Geoff Johns' version of what Harley Quinn and the Joker would be like. But in reality, that's not the case. That when it comes to the Joker himself, he's just an insane man. Depending on what origin you're reading, either it's tragic or it's just kind of how things fell. Now, the fact that Joker has a Batman, it's kind of something to notice here. Of course, we saw that play out in the last video that we did in the last story. So it's not like it just kind of came out of nowhere. But it's not like he's just like, oh, we got to take him and torture him and we got to do all these crazy things. He's just like, yep, I got Batman. Business as usual. Like, that's kind of how it feels. Because what this is Geoff Johns doing is saying, yeah, Joker's got Batman and that's a big deal. But there's much bigger deals coming down the line, namely Superman and Dr. Manhattan. So it's like the one thing everybody's excited for. But from here, we basically end up running into a handful of henchmen, basically, of Mr. Freeze. Now, when the Joker comes across these guys, we end up finding out that Mr. Freeze is kind of vanished. Now, we'll find out where he went to, but they're like, Mr. Freeze is kind of vanished. Like, we don't really know where he went to. He went off the grid. He's off the radar. And so the Joker's response is, well, then join my crew. Now, it's one of these things where if the Joker comes across your path and he extends you an invitation to join his crew, it's not really an invitation you can turn down. Now, at this point, we switch back to the past of Marionette, with her father essentially, running this shop called Maze Glass. And it's kind of interesting because what happened, there's another kid across the street whose family runs another store themselves. Now, of course, this guy, as most of you guys have probably guessed, is essentially Mime. Like he's the guy that will grow up to become Mime. But it's kind of cool because Marionette immediately takes a liking to him. But the problem is that this kid doesn't really talk. He doesn't really say anything. And he's actually kind of astounded by like all these puppets and all these things that are there. So again, this is kind of jumping back and forth, this sort of switching back between the origin of Mime and Marionette and jumping back to the current moment. But one thing to also keep in mind here is that Mime and Marionette weren't really crazy. They're just kind of out doing their own thing, and they basically play up a gimmick that is in relation to their characters. Of course, Marionette, as we know, took up the mantle because her father was a puppet guy, and Mime doesn't really talk. So we know like the roles they play reflect the lives they've led, but they've never encountered anyone like the Joker before. Because remember, Mime and Marionette are basically displaced from the Watchmen universe, quote unquote, and so they're used to more like grounded people, like people who are villains, but are really more of like fly-by-night villains. They're more kind of goofy, or they just sort of do things. Like if a crazy person decided to dress up as like as a gladiator and decide they want to rob a store. Like, that's the kind of villain that they're used to. They're not used to someone like the Joker. The Joker is so chaotic. The Joker is so unpredictable. It makes it crazy. And when the option's given, like, hey, do you guys want to join my thing too? Joker's like, no. Mime and Marionette are like, no, we're not going to. But at the same time, they're also pretty intense because they basically escape the Joker's schemes by like poking out the eyes of one of the henchmen, with Marionette decapitating the other. So it's not like they're helpless, right? It's not like, oh wow, this is a crazy situation, but I don't know how to deal with this. Not at all. The issue here is that when the Joker, it really comes when the Joker takes out one of his own guys. That's really what kind of baffles Mime and Marionette to a degree, and even baffles the henchmen of Mr. Freeze, because for the most part, it's kind of to be expected for us as the reader. But if you're Mime and Marionette, it's just kind of like, this is a little weird. But the more they stay together, the more different they are, the more similarities they find they have between the other. But the fact remains here, jumping back to the past of Marionette, the really sort of coming together moment of Marionette and Mime comes in the fact that Marionette's basically being taunted by a handful of bullies. And so, they literally like string her up. I mean, they hold her in place and just start beating the crap out of her when she starts to fight back. And so, of course, here comes Mime, cracks a bottle over the head of one of them, and then just starts beating him with a broken beer bottle. Now, of course, as we know, bullies don't get second chances. And so this literally leads to Marionette just like chasing this girl down. Like when she flees for her life, she chases her down, just starts pummeling the heck out of her. She tries to apologize. And then in turn, like Marionette's like, do you have another bottle so we can help this girl finish with all of her living? And so it's pretty intense. But here's one of the other things to bear in mind too. Even at a young age, they're moving towards a direction where it's just the two of us. That's really kind of the road they're going in. And so it's kind of cool because what ends up happening is, following the Joker, we end up finding out that what's essentially happening, the reason why Mr. Freeze vanished is because all the villains of DC have essentially located in one place, or at least the most notable villains. But you have like Hector Hammond, basically the Earth-based villains, Hector Hammond, the Penguin, Two-Face, all these different guys. But they're all basically being led by the Riddler. The Riddler basically says, like, we're all coming together to form our own secret society of supervillains, or Legion of Doom, or whatever it is that you want to call it. But it's basically Geoff Johns' way of saying, like, this old formation of the villains banding together, against like the superhero community is going to return. It's going to come back. But notice there's kind of a veritable who's who here. Like, for example, you have Dr. Savannah. Now, of course, we know Savannah's going to be here because of the fact that Shazam is coming back. But you've also got like, Captain Cold, you've got Boomerang. Here's something else too that I don't believe has been introduced yet in the mainline DC comics. You've got the Judge of Owls, where you have the Court of Owls, and then you've got like the Monarchy of Owls, or whatever in the world is called. Now you've got the Judge of Owls, which is basically the one person who's in charge of like all the owls of the Batman mythos that exist out there in the world. So it's kind of cool to see that expanded. But then you also see them hitting at Typhoon. Now, Typhoon's a character who's been around for a long, long time. So he's not really like a rework of Dr. Manhattan. But here's a funny thing, he could be. And the reason why I say that is, the clearest similarity between the two is the color of their skin, the fact that they're both blue. But in truth, David Drake made his debut back in Flash number 294, way back in the day. So again, he's been around for a very, very, very long time. His power is just weather manipulation. He's mostly been a Flash villain, and his powers have been confined on a smaller scale. He's never really been like a major player. But in reality, it wouldn't be that hard for Dr. Manhattan to just like take out the original Typhoon, dress up as Typhoon, and then go into the main DC universe. The question is why? Like, why would Dr. Manhattan do that? Which is why it's really not a believable theory, but it is kind of a funny idea to sort of toy around with. But then from here, we basically switch back again to the origin of Marionette. And this is when we end up finding out that what had basically been happening at this time when she was a little kid is that her father was basically being shaken down by the cops. The cops were crooked. They were coming in and they were just saying, like, you owe us a debt, basically, like you owe us a tithe of sorts. Of course, they also end up dropping the news that this young kid, Marcos, that his mom died. She essentially fell down a fire escape, and that was really the end of her. But again, it's another one of these things where it's just like they live a pretty rough life. There's a lot of really, really shady things going on here. Not only that, kind of jumping back to the current moment, we end up finding out this is not the first time the Joker's shown up with a Batman trying to get himself into this team, which is so Joker. It's exactly what Joker would do. Like from what we're being told, previously, the Joker had shown up with like a prison guard from Arkham Asylum, dressed him as the Batman and said, I've captured the Batman. See guys, can I join your team now? It's kind of a funny little thing. Now, of course, this leads to a bit of a skirmish between like Typhoon and the rest of the villains, because it's just kind of like, hey, look, you're Typhoon. Like, you really don't need to be here, man. Like, you're pretty small time. And then, of course, in the middle of all this, Typhoon gets shot in the face. And this is when things really pop off, because we end up finding out the person who shot Typhoon in the face is the comedian. And dude, okay, so this is when things get so awesome because then it's literally a bloodbath. He's just firing on everyone, like all these different villains. He's taking every last one of them out. Now Mime starts making his way over to try to take out Comedian, and Marionette immediately calls him back, but of course he doesn't necessarily respond. Instead, like Giganta gets in the way of Comedian, and then of course he kind of has to jump out of the way of her onslaught. But from there, like it's literally taking pot shots. I mean, it's like the Punisher rolled into like the hideout of like all the Marvel villains and just starts shooting everybody to pieces. That's what the Comedian's doing right now. Like he literally shows up in this place and just starts taking all of them out. But like most people here just kind of react the way you would expect, like they just kind of scatter. But like for most people, they don't really know what's going on. The response of Marionette is, we have to get out of here. This is the Comedian. He will kill us all. But notice this, where we as the reader would look at this and we would think that initially the Joker has more in common with Mime and Marionette than anybody else. The Joker actually has more in common with the Comedian. That sure, the Comedian is a vigilante, but it's like Mime and Marionette and the Comedian both represent different sides of the Joker. But it's basically like, it's him just, it's a Comedian like, hey, look, I'm gonna kill you all. So like you can run if you want to, but I will find you. I'll track you down and then I'll take you out. So it's one of these crazy things because it's like this is exactly how we would expect the Comedian's arrival to unfold in this whole landscape of DC Comics. And so again, switching back to this last, this next little tidbit of Marionette's origin, the cops show up again. But the issue is that the father basically stands up and says, I can't let you guys shake me down anymore, especially not in front of my daughter, because what she's gonna do is she's gonna grow up believing, give people whatever they want and life will be easier, which is a terrible way to live. The issue with this, the response to this is they grab Marionette, they bring her out and they're like, look, you can give us what we want or we will kill your daughter. What we end up finding out is that this guy, the father is essentially just kind of like, he's got an actual financial tithe he has to pay, money that has to be given, which is currently hidden inside the Night Owl doll, which of course, they crack it open, they take the money out, and they end up leaving. That's where he stores, the extra cash. And so what ends up happening here is it's this situation where, she goes and, after this whole scenario, she basically goes and ends up hanging out with Marcos, and starts, poking around, asking questions. Can you really not talk? Like what in the world's going on? She returns back to the shop, after, the next day or so, only to find that her father hung himself. And this is when things get really, really crazy because now it's just her. She's alone. There's no one else there. This is all that's left because her father leaves a note behind that says, look, they would have never stopped coming. It's one of these things. If you give an inch, you give a mile. You give in to them the first time and they'll keep coming back. The only way to make them stop is to get rid of them. But in this instance, I'm leaving you behind because now you can go out and you can make your own life. And so in response to this, where he says, empty the till, take the money and leave, when the cops show up to collect their tithe, she stabs one of them in the neck. Now, where the other one starts to panic, this is when like Mime runs in, bites the other one, offers himself as a distraction of sorts, and then like literally Marionette comes running in with basically with a marionette wire and strangles the guy to death. So like right off the bat, like it's basically just the two of us. We're the only two in the world that we can count on. This is it. It's essentially like the fallout from this whole situation, from their initial origin. This sort of comes home to roost when they have this conversation, because when they get back to their safe house, she's like, you can't leave me like that. Like if I don't have you, I don't have anybody else. Like this is it, because we end up finding out that following this, they made their way on the street the best way they could. They literally did what they had to do in order to make ends meet. So it's one of these things where it's like look, it's just us. Like we have to stick together. We're the only real connection the two of us have, and we have to go find our baby together. So it's a pretty important moment, and it really gives a lot of depth to the character. Now from there, the Comedian comes, like tracked him down. The Comedian lived up to his word, and he's like, I will find you. Literally tracked them down and says, you guys can come with me and you guys can show me where Ozymandias is, or I can kill one of you and make the other show me. Of course, in the midst of all this, the Comedian's essentially knocked out from behind, and we end up finding the Joker was the one who did it. And so of course the Joker steals the Comedian's button, and it's just kind of like, well, I'm curious about this Dr. Manhattan guy. Like, what's the deal with this Dr. Manhattan? Like, we should go find Dr. Manhattan. And this is awesome, because what it means is the Joker will meet Dr. Manhattan. Here's the question you have to ask. What influence will one of them have on the other? That's what I want to know. But with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.